August 3, 1943, should have been the kind of day George S. Patton remembered forever for all the right reasons. Lieutenant General Patton was riding the highest wave of his career. Word had reached him that General Dwight D. Eisenhower intended to award him the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. In the brutal opening of the Sicily campaign, Patton had been everywhere the fighting was hottest. 3 weeks earlier, during the landings at Gela, when a German counterattack threatened to shove the Americans back into the sea, Patton had not stayed behind a map table. He had gone forward, into the chaos, standing in open view while shells and bullets cracked the air, directing naval gunfire and forcing order into panic. It was the kind of leadership that could not be faked and could not be ignored. He had steadied the invasion when it looked like it might break. Now Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, was going to pin a medal on his chest. But Patton was not the sort of man who could simply accept praise and rest. That afternoon, flushed with momentum and convinced he was doing something noble, he decided to visit wounded soldiers at the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. He told himself it was about gratitude, about honoring men who had paid in blood for every mile. He wanted to shake hands. He wanted to look them in the eye. He wanted to be seen, yes, but also to show them that their commander cared. The idea sounded pure. The reality that unfolded inside those canvas walls would nearly destroy everything he had built. And it would put Eisenhower in a position where one wrong move could detonate both their careers. Patton arrived around noon, his uniform immaculate, his posture rigid, his famous pearl-handled revolvers at his hips, like props from a legend he had helped write himself. Colonel Donald C. C., the hospital commander, met him and guided him through the ward. The air inside the tent was heavy with antiseptic, sweat, and the soft misery of men who had not slept without pain in weeks. Patton moved along the rows of cots, pausing, leaning in close, gripping hands, offering praise with theatrical tenderness. Some soldiers, boys still, blinked back tears when the famous general spoke to them. Nurses watched with a kind of cautious awe. For a moment, it looked like a scene built for history books, the hard warrior honoring the wounded. Then Patton stopped in front of a soldier sitting on a stool in the middle of the ward. Private Charles Cool, 27 years old, from Mishawaka, Indiana. He wore the lining of a steel helmet. There was no visible blood, no bandaged limb, no obvious wound to justify his place among the shattered bodies around him. Patton asked what was wrong. The private's voice was small. He said he was nervous. He said he guessed he just could not take it. To Patton, raised on an older idea of war, those words were poison. Something snapped. It was not measured. It was not thoughtful. It was a fuse reaching powder. Patton's face hardened, and his voice turned cruel. He called the man a coward. He called him a yellow-bellied bastard. Before anyone could understand what was happening, Patton slapped him across the face with his gloves. The sound was sharp, humiliating, and it froze the entire ward. Then he grabbed the private by the collar, yanked him up, and dragged him toward the tent entrance as if he were removing something filthy from a clean room. Patton kicked him out into the bright Sicilian sun. Doctors stared. Nurses stiffened. Men on cots turned their heads, stunned, watching the scene like a slow-motion wreck. Patton bellowed at a physician in disbelief, ordering him not to admit, "This son of a..." again. He shouted that he did not want yellow-bellied bastards hiding cowardice inside a place of honor. Stinking up the ward. And then, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, he walked out and continued his tour of the front. It would have been bad enough if that had been the end of it. But war has a way of testing a man's weaknesses twice, as if to confirm what is real. 1 week later, on August 10th, 1943, Patton visited another evacuation hospital near San Stefano. The Seventh Army was grinding forward toward Messina, victory close enough that officers were already tasting it. The mood should have been triumph, exhaustion with a reward at the end. Inside that ward, Patton came face to face with another soldier whose wounds did not bleed on the outside. Private Paul G. Bennett, a field artillery gunner from North Carolina, was shaking. His body was dehydrated, feverish, hollowed out. He had watched his best friend get torn apart by enemy fire. He had been in combat since North Africa. He had not shirked the hard hours, but something inside him had broken in a way he could not explain. When Patton asked what was wrong, Bennett said it was his nerves. He said he could not stand the shelling anymore. This time, Patton's temper did not ignite. It exploded. Another truth surfaced as Bradley grew older. Patton was not built for peace. He was forged for crisis. In a world that demanded diplomacy, patience, and careful phrasing, Patton's strengths became liabilities. Bradley came to believe that Patton belonged to an earlier age, an age of Caesars and Napoleons, where victory mattered more than explanation, where war did not have to be justified to microphones and headlines. But modern warfare had politics welded into it, and peace had even sharper rules. Patton could not live inside those rules. Bradley could. That difference defined them. Bradley belonged to the future, an era where wars were judged not just by who won, but by how, and at what moral and political cost. Patton belonged to the brutal purity of the battlefield, where momentum can crush an enemy before the enemy can recover. That night, Patton wrote in his diary, coldly justifying himself. He argued that companies should deal with men like that, and if they shirked duty, they should be tried for cowardice and shot. To him, fear was something to be beaten out of a man. He did not recognize battle fatigue as injury. He saw it as rot. But the people who witnessed it recognized something else, a commander losing control in a place where control was sacred. Word moved fast. A nurse who had seen the second incident told her boyfriend, a captain in public affairs. He told reporters. And within days, nearly every American and British correspondent covering the Seventh Army knew the truth. The story was radioactive. Striking a subordinate was a court-martial offense. Pulling a pistol on a wounded man in a hospital tent was the kind of scandal that could burn through the entire high command. And yet, the strangest thing happened. No one printed it. Not one of them. About 60 journalists had the story. 60 men and women who lived on scandal and truth and deadlines, who competed for headlines the way generals competed for cities. They had what could have been the biggest American military controversy of the war so far, and they chose to bury it. Drew Pearson had not spoken yet. Congress had not erupted yet. The public had no idea. The war machine kept turning. One reporter, Damari Bess of the Saturday Evening Post, took control of what became an unofficial pact. He gathered correspondence, organized an informal investigation, and insisted they verify everything. They interviewed doctors, they interviewed nurses, they interviewed soldiers who had witnessed both incidents. They built a case so solid, it could not be dismissed as rumor. Then Bess went to Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers and laid it in front of him. He told Eisenhower the correspondents had agreed to kill the story for now. He said, in effect, that they were Americans first and correspondents second. But he also delivered the warning like a blade. Every mother in America would assume her son could be next to be slapped. This could not come out without consequences. Eisenhower already knew. Hospital commanders had filed reports through the chain of command. He had felt the problem forming like a storm on the horizon. Now the storm was directly over his head, and it was his move. Eisenhower understood the stakes in a way few people did. If he relieved Patton, he would lose the most aggressive combat commander the United States had. The Germans respected Patton more than any other Allied general. They tracked his name. They watched for him. They feared the speed and violence he brought to battle. Removing him would be more than a disciplinary act. It would be a signal to the enemy that America had broken one of its sharpest weapons. But if Eisenhower protected Patton and the story later surfaced, it would look like a cover-up. Politicians would howl. The public would demand blood. Eisenhower's own judgment, his own integrity, could be questioned at the worst possible moment, when the Allies needed unity more than purity. He chose a narrow path, and he walked it carefully. Eisenhower dictated a letter to Patton that balanced military reality against moral condemnation. He wrote that he understood firm and drastic measures were sometimes necessary to achieve objectives. But he also wrote that this did not excuse brutality, abuse of the sick, or the exhibition of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates. He told Patton he was not opening a formal investigation, but the message was still a knife. Eisenhower said he had to question Patton's good judgment and self-discipline so seriously that it raised doubts about his future usefulness. Privately, Eisenhower admitted to his staff what he truly believed. If this ever got out, he said, they would be howling for Patton's scalp, and it would be the end of him in this war. Eisenhower said plainly that he could not let that happen. Patton was indispensable, one of the guarantors of victory. The Supreme Commander was making a choice: keep the fighting man, risk the stain. Then Eisenhower gave Patton an order Patton hated more than any reprimand: apologize. Not quietly, not behind closed doors, and not just to the two men. Eisenhower demanded Patton apologize to everyone who had witnessed the incidents, and then to the divisions of the 7th Army, so the damage would not fester in silence. Patton resisted. He told himself he had been right. He believed fear was contagious and mercy was weakness. But Eisenhower was not negotiating. He was commanding. On August 21, 1943, Patton went to Paul Bennett's bedside and shook his hand. He apologized. The act looked humble on paper. Inside Patton, it burned. That night, he wrote bitterly in his diary that it was a strange commentary on justice when an army commander had to soft-soap a skulker to placate public opinion. He still did not understand what the doctors understood, that Bennett's injury was real. After that, Patton went on a tour of his divisions. At each stop, he gathered as many men as possible, and he spoke to them directly. He admitted he had conducted himself in a way unbecoming an American officer. He apologized. The speeches were not polished. They were not comfortable. But they were necessary. Eisenhower was trying to seal a wound before it infected the army. Patton finished his apology tour and waited, like a man standing beneath a guillotine, to see whether his career would survive the blade. For months, the story remained buried. The agreement held. The correspondents kept their word. Patton's disgrace stayed contained, trapped in reports and whispers. Then, on November 21, 1943, at 7 o'clock in the evening Eastern Time, a voice on the radio shattered the silence. Drew Pearson opened his weekly broadcast with a story designed to explode. He reported that Lieutenant General George S. Patton had struck a soldier in a field hospital in Sicily. He said Patton had been severely censured by Eisenhower. He added that he did not expect Patton to be used in important combat again. The news hit America like a thrown brick through a window. Pearson was famous for breaking what others avoided. He had sources, and he did not respect agreements he had not signed. By the next day, Eisenhower's headquarters issued a statement saying Patton had never been reprimanded at any time by Eisenhower or by anyone else in that theater. It was a careful denial. Technically, Eisenhower had written a letter of censure, not a formal reprimand. The wording was true. The spirit was evasive. And it fooled almost no one. Congress erupted. Representative Jed Johnson of Oklahoma called Patton's conduct despicable and demanded his removal. Representative Charles Hoven of Iowa, a veteran of the First World War, spoke of tyrants and said men like Patton had no place in uniform. Senator Robert Reynolds of North Carolina thundered that Patton should be brought home and forced to apologize to the American people. Newspapers ran editorials demanding punishment. Letters flooded the War Department. Some defended Patton, praising results over manners. Many more condemned him, horrified at the idea of a general assaulting sick soldiers. Now, the 60 reporters who had kept the story quiet were forced to explain themselves. Some admitted they had made an agreement. Others tried to frame it as patriotism. Some simply stayed silent, uncomfortable at being judged for a decision made in wartime shadows. The question became brutal and simple. Would Eisenhower sacrifice Patton to satisfy the politicians? Or would he stand by the general he believed America needed? Eisenhower refused to break. He sent a message to the War Department defending his decision to retain Patton. He argued that Patton was too valuable to lose. He cited the results in Sicily. He admitted Patton had failed as a man in that moment, but insisted his ability as a commander outweighed the disgrace. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson backed Eisenhower publicly and warned Congress that command decisions were military judgments best left to the commander in the field. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall also supported Eisenhower, reminding those calling for blood of Abraham Lincoln's famous line about Ulysses S. Grant, "I cannot spare this man. He fights." The comparison was not accidental. Grant had been attacked, mocked, accused of being a butcher and a drunk. He had still won the Civil War. Patton had slapped 2 soldiers, yes, but he might be the kind of weapon that ended the war sooner and saved lives in the long run. That was the cold calculus Eisenhower and Marshall were willing to make. Then something happened that shifted the tone of the controversy in a way no speech in Congress could. Private Charles Cool, the first soldier Patton had slapped, spoke to reporters. He did not call for Patton's head. He did not demand revenge. He said quietly that the general might have been suffering battle fatigue himself. Cool returned to combat after his hospital stay. Later, he would land in Normandy on D-Day with his unit. He did not want to destroy Patton. He did not want to be the man whose humiliation ended a war fighter's career. Paul Bennett also returned to duty and served through the remainder of the war. He never became the public accuser Patton's enemies wanted. The men Patton had called cowards proved they were not cowards. They went back into fire. And their restraint, their dignity, their refusal to turn their pain into a political knife, made Patton's behavior look even uglier by contrast. Eventually, the public outrage cooled. America had new battles to worry about, new lists of dead, new headlines. But Patton's punishment did not end with the fading of the scandal. For months upon months, he held no combat command. He sat in Palermo while the war raged without him, trapped in a gilded exile. His 7th Army was stripped away. Units were transferred for the invasion of Italy and for the eventual assault on France. Patton watched other men climb. He watched Omar Bradley, his former subordinate, rise into positions Patton believed belonged to him. In September of 1943, Bradley was selected to command the 1st United States Army forming in England, the very command Patton wanted most, the command he believed he had earned. Eisenhower insisted the choice had been made before the scandal became public. Patton did not believe it. The hardest part for him was not the criticism, not the editorials calling him a brute, not the politicians demanding his scalp. The hardest part was sitting idle while the war continued, while other men fought the war he had prepared his entire life to fight. Patton was built for movement. Stillness was torture. And then Eisenhower did something unexpected. He found a way to turn Patton's disgrace into a weapon. In early 1944, the Allies were building the invasion of France. They needed to deceive the Germans about where the blow would fall. They needed Berlin to believe the main attack would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. So they created a phantom army, the First United States Army Group, an army that existed on paper and in illusion. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, staged camps, fake radio traffic, and carefully planted rumors. But a ghost army needed a commander with weight, someone the Germans would fear enough to take the bait. It needed Patton. Eisenhower summoned him to England and put him in charge of the fake army. German intelligence swallowed it. They respected Patton too much to believe the Allies would waste him on a secondary effort. When June 6, 1944 arrived and the real invasion crashed into Normandy, the Germans were still waiting for Patton elsewhere. Even after D-Day, they suspected Normandy was a feint. They kept divisions near Calais that could have been thrown against the beaches. By the time they realized the truth, the foothold had hardened into a front. The deception had worked. The slapping scandal had kept Patton away from the command he wanted on the day he most wanted it. But it also made him the perfect decoy, a legend temporarily caged and therefore believable as the spear point of a strike that never came. Finally, on August 1, 1944, Patton returned to combat. He took command of the Third Army as it activated in France. What followed was exactly what the Germans had feared and what Eisenhower had gambled on. Patton moved like a storm. Within weeks, his tanks were racing across countryside at speeds that stunned even Allied planners. He broke out of Normandy. He swept through Brittany. He turned east with an appetite for territory and collapse. The enemy who had waited for him at Calais now faced him in fields and towns, and they discovered the reality was worse than the legend. Patton pushed his men hard. He demanded speed, aggression, constant pressure. His advance became one of the fastest in modern military history, and his Third Army seemed to live on momentum itself. The final year of the war became a sequence of brutal tests and decisive breakthroughs. Relief efforts, river crossings, winter counterattacks, the long drive into Germany. Patton's name kept appearing where movement mattered most. And when Germany surrendered in May of 1945, Patton's army had advanced farther and faster than any other Allied force, capturing enormous stretches of enemy territory and taking staggering numbers of prisoners. The politicians who had once demanded his downfall now celebrated him. The newspapers that had once called him a brute now praised him as a genius. The exile, the scandal, the near destruction of his career, none of it had erased the fact that he delivered results when results were needed. But the slapping incidents never vanished. They remained part of his legacy because they revealed something true. Patton could be brilliant and cruel at the same time. He could inspire and humiliate. He could elevate men with praise one moment and crush them with contempt the next. He was a weapon, and weapons are not gentle. Eisenhower had made his choice under pressure, with imperfect options. He could protect Patton and risk public fury, or sacrifice him and risk the war effort. He protected him because he believed America needed its most aggressive commander to win. The correspondents who held the story for months made a similar calculation. They decided victory mattered more than exposure in that moment. Drew Pearson believed he was exposing a scandal, and he was, but he also exposed something deeper: the uncomfortable reality that wartime decisions are sometimes made in the space between morality and necessity. George S. Patton died in December of 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. He never faced a court-martial for what happened in those hospital tents. He never paid an official price beyond months of removal and the stain of public disgrace. Private Charles Cool returned home after the war and lived quietly, working and aging away from headlines. He never sued. He never wrote a tell-all. He carried the memory and moved on. Paul Bennett also survived, living with his own private history of being struck and threatened by a man celebrated by the nation. History does not judge men by their worst moment alone, but it does not erase it either. It judges the sum. George S. Patton slapped 2 soldiers in Sicily and revealed a hard, ugly truth about himself. George S. Patton also drove an army through Europe with a speed and violence that helped end a global nightmare. Both things are true. Both things matter. And in the end, when the war was won and the dust settled, the voices demanding Patton's scalp faded into the background. The name that remained, for better or worse, was the general who fought, and the commander Eisenhower chose to save because he believed victory required men like Patton, even when they were hardest to defend.